So to discuss all these very important questions for Ukraine and for all Europe and the safety and defense of Europe, we want to present you our guest. It's Jason Smart, political consultant. Hi, glad to see you.
Good to see you as well.
So I want to hear your perception of the situation in our military enterprises of Ukraine, of Europe, of collaboration between Europe and Ukraine, how it's strengthened since the year and a half already of the start of full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine.
So, I mean, obviously the production of weapons in Europe itself have been on the decline. And that's something we see now. It's part of the reason that Ukraine has struggled to receive the huge quantity of weapons it needs from its European partners. Now, it's something that's obviously trying to improve. And recent announcements by, for instance, the British arms manufacturers that they were interested in opening factories within Ukraine is, of course, a great sign. But there's still a lot left to be done. That's why Ukraine is so dependent on this point on assistance from the United States, not just shells and tanks, but also high technologies. And as the war moves on, it's going to become ever more important that Ukraine is able to find resources for this. Where is it produced? Who can produce it in the quantities that are necessary? But fortunately, it's not just Ukraine that's struggling with this problem. Ukraine is receiving what it needs. It's going to receive more, and I hope it is soon. But Russia is also suffering from this, and this is something that's a good sign. Unlike Russia, Ukraine has a lot of friends. Ukraine has all of the European countries and other nations around the world that produce weapons. Whereas the Russians are forced to seek out friendships with isolated nations like Iran and North Korea. There's far less options on the table for the Russians and less advanced technologies than are those that are available for Ukraine.
As soon as you mentioned the financial question, I want to ask you if this military sphere is quite profitable, I would say, in the economy. Not talking just about the security question, but the economic question and effects on Europe and on Ukraine. Is it profitable, and how it will change the landscape of economy of European continent?
Well, of course, the defense industry is a massive industry in many countries, including in the United States and in Germany and Britain. They're huge. They're multi-billion-dollar corporations. And so when there are more contracts given, it is something that is going to be a ability that will give the opportunity to have a increased chance for Ukraine to develop partnerships that are based on economic interest. If these countries realize that their relationship with Ukraine is beneficial to themselves, that is, they are creating jobs back home, they are creating more of a tax base, that's all positive for them. And that's something that they should know. That's something they should recognize, is that it's not simply like giving assistance to Ukraine. Let's be honest. They are creating jobs. They are opening factories. They are going to have more taxes that come in from this. And so this is all positives for those European countries. This is not something that's simply helping Ukraine because they're nice. This is something that will help them ultimately as well.
How do you think the competition in this area, the military area of production, will be positive or is positive for all the participants of this process, or it might bring some delays in the planning in helping Ukraine? As an example, we remember how it was so long discussion which country will receive money from European Union to build the enterprises for producing the ammunition for Ukraine. So is the same example, or it's more for effectiveness of our cooperation?
Well, it does help the overall effectiveness, of course. Which countries will have the end-all construction? There's only a few countries in Europe that produce, in the quantities necessary, the type of weaponry that Ukraine needs. There's only so many countries that produce tanks in the world. This is not something that's churned out by every little nation. And so these sorts of things, the key players, the big states, are the ones that Ukraine has continued to closely work with. And it seems that there is hope that more weaponry from them will continue to come. And there's at this point, let's be honest, it's not a huge amount of money we're talking about. And I'll cite the example of the United States just because it's, I think, stunning. When you consider the United States by far is the largest supporter of Ukraine in real terms, it is in total value of money given and weaponry given. it's only equated to about 3.5% of the U.S. defense budget per year is the assistance given to Ukraine. And to put this to another terms, to show you like how really small this is, it's only 0.3% of the total U.S. budget. 0.3% of the U.S. budget is spent on Ukraine. This is a very, very, very small number. And so ultimately, the arguments made that there's not enough money for it in Europe or made not enough money for it in the U.S. is simply baseless. The fact is, this is a very small economic commitment, which doesn't only guarantee Ukraine's security, but operates directly in the national security interest of its NATO partners in Europe and the U.S. in the fact that now, by stopping Russia in Ukraine, it prevents future conflict in the Baltics or in Poland or in other places.
When we talk about now in this episode, the cooperation and building military enterprises with our international partners here in Ukraine, I mean, is it profitable for each of the participants? Because we understand not all the produced equipment will go to the battlefield. Is it planned to produce as much, not for Ukraine, but for defense needs of European countries as well, but in these enterprises built in Ukraine?
Sure. I mean, the European countries as well, due to the outbreak of this war, have realized that there's a need to increase their own security. And we've seen an increase in the amount of spending by a lot of nations because they've realized, the commitments they've made so far, though it's supposed to be, in theory, 2% according to the NATO standards, many of them were not meeting that standard. More than that, a lot of them just sort of did not take it seriously. They did not think that there was a potential for a real threat to Europe or a real potential for Russian aggression to strike out, and that was sort of a relic of the Cold War. Fortunately, this is a moment where they've woken up and they are starting to take the steps necessary to better prepare themselves and to better to provide weaponry that they themselves might need if there were to be a future conflict. One thing that's very interesting about the weaponry given to Ukraine so far, worth mentioning, I think, is that when we talk about the United States support, and Lend-Lease is a good example of that, what was the objective behind this? The objective is that it gave the president the ability to send weaponry to Ukraine without going through a new spending bill in Congress every single time. It wasn't simply to give Ukraine tons of weapons. It was to give the president the ability to give Ukraine tons of weapons. So why then is Ukraine still lacking some weaponry? And that comes down to a political question. It's ultimately the decision of the White House, the president of the United States, if he agrees and is ready to send the weaponry at that moment or wishes to wait. As Ukraine is receiving largely weapons that is called drawdown, that is weapons that are taken out of the U.S. military arsenal. These are not new weapons. These are not being bought, contracted out of a factory, and then sent directly to Ukraine. A lot of this weaponry is actually stuff that we already had sitting somewhere or another in the world, one of the many U.S. military bases. And they're taking those that are either old, obsolete, or the U.S. wasn't going to use in the near term and they expire. And so it was actually cheaper for the United States to give Ukraine the weapons than to destroy them because we have expiration dates and all these things. So if it doesn't get used by a certain date, they destroy it. But that costs money. It's not cheap. And so it's actually much cheaper, for instance, to give shells that are expiring to Ukraine and to allow Ukraine to defend itself with weapons that are good. There's nothing bad. It's not expired medicine or expired food. There's nothing bad that will happen with this. But these are things that just to meet the standards that we have are not something that we do discard after a period of time. But by giving it to Ukraine, it's obviously, one, strategically wise for us, for our own national security interest, also economically wise, as it saves us money.
You mentioned the political interest, so let's look at it a little bit wider than just the United States and Ukraine. Let's look at the cooperation with Turkey. I'm asking because in addition to military interest, we understand that Turkey helps a lot to Ukraine in building enterprises, helping with drones, Bayraktar, and so on. After the meeting, not very successful in Sochi of President Erdogan and Putin, how do you think this situation politically will or might change the cooperation or strengthen the cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine in the military fields?
So in the case of the military field, I think that Turkey has actually probably been one of the most fascinating players in this whole show. Turkey, as everyone is aware, had historically had pretty good relations with Russia. And for that matter, Vladimir Putin himself says that he admires Erdogan, the leader of Turkey. And Turkey, though, has not been seduced by Russia, fortunately. Turkey, a NATO ally, has been quite wise and quite smart as how it's played this game by not being so publicly critical of Putin, which I think is not a bad thing. I do not criticize that, others do, is because that is the specifically reason that Erdogan has the ability to now meet with Putin. And we do need somebody, and I'm happy it's not us, but I'm happy it's him, that is able to then have meetings with Putin and to try to persuade the Russians of things. But as far as it goes with direct support from Turkey, they have a very clear strategic interest here. Look, what's going on? The Black Sea, for instance, is not the Russian Sea. This is the Black Sea. And so Turkey obviously has a very vested interest in the waters there. And so Russia's unilateral decision to cut off the grain deal, the unilateral decision to mine waters, these are things that Turkey is obviously offended by because it's against their security interest and is obviously quite damaging to their own economy if the Black Sea becomes a battlefield. They have no interest in seeing that happen. And so they are able to put Russia in check in a way that other countries cannot, not just because they control the straits, but because they control a significant military power. And that's why Turkish innovation, specifically in the area of drones, I think has been significant. The Bayraktar drones that Ukraine has received have done wonders. I mean, we've all seen the videos of how effective they are. And I think that Turkey as a whole is a country that has, throughout the war, shown that it is a very good ally of the West and of Ukraine. And going forward, I think that Russia has another threat coming from Turkey, which is this. Central Asia is an area which is largely Turkic-speaking, whether it's Kyrgyz or Uzbek or Kazakh, they're Turkish languages. And why that's important? Turkey has, for a couple of decades now, invested incredible sums of money to persuade those regions to warm up to Turkey. They've opened schools there and other things. And increasingly, Central Asians look at Turkey as their natural ally. The way that Moscow used to be the center of the Soviet Union, now Ankara is becoming the center of Turkish people. So they no longer look at Moscow, but they look towards Ankara. And that's already something that is going to be a significant geostrategic shift for them. And if they do make that shift, and they do start to align their foreign policies closer to Turkey, that will be a significant blow to Russia's empire. And I think will contribute to its overall collapse.